Chapter 1 Wednesday, March 27th, 2013 at 3:06 p.m. Hi, is this Jenny's dad? Yeah. This is Stephanie, one of the managers at Barnes & Noble, where Jenny works. I'm calling to let you know that Jenny was just found unconscious in a snowbank outside the store. Almost everyone has experienced a life-defining moment, but how often do those experiences also forever redefine the meaning of and our reaction to specific words and phrases? The word deterioration can have many meanings. Many times it refers to the effect weather has on an old building or a piece of machinery. Unfortunately, it can also refer to someone's health. People can deteriorate as well, usually via old age, but also at the hands of drug abuse and even cancer, or some other devastating disease. While usually all forms of deterioration are gradual, and oftentimes steps can be taken to inhibit or even reverse the process, because of what ultimately transpired after receiving this phone call, I will forever understand that deterioration can be ravenous in its speed and relentless despite all efforts to stop it. A parent's worst nightmare can also encompass a multitude of things, based specifically on what a child is experiencing at that very moment. I imagine most people fear the death of their child and believe that would be their worst nightmare. While I do not argue that idea, I have to think that any situation in which a parent does not know whether their child will fully recover also deserves the phrase. With that phone call from Stephanie, my family began a 5-month odyssey that went beyond anything we could have predicted or even dared to imagine. We now understand firsthand that we dare not put boundaries on what a parent's worst nightmare really is. Because we may have to be wide awake for most of the thousands of hours that we are forced to experience it. Stephanie informed me that an ambulance had been called and put me in touch with an EMT who stated that Jenny was already in the ambulance and being transported to a nearby hospital. I questioned the EMT as to whether Jenny had been assaulted, and she assured me that she had not, but rather believed that Jenny had suffered a seizure. Who could have imagined how the confirmation of a seizure over assault would qualify as the last bit of reliable and relatively good information I would receive for weeks? Yet it would rather be another 2 days before there would be any indication that something was seriously wrong with Jenny. And even then, I think I denied what I was seeing. Rather than coming on suddenly and with any clarity, this nightmare unfolded slowly. Initially, there were only hints of what was to come. The demons that would take control of my daughter's body and my family's life only showed their faces for brief moments and were oftentimes dismissed with feeble explanations. However, once the full measure of what was in store for us began to unfold, I would often think, "This can't get any worse," only to realize just hours later that it had. Eventually there came a time when I realized I could not awaken myself from the nightmare. The moment that I took Stephanie's phone call will be etched in my mind forever. I was standing behind my car with the trunk open in the parking lot of one of my business customers in Princeburg, Minnesota. A feeling of helplessness immediately washed over me. I needed to get a hospital that was an hour and a half away in St. Louis Park. Jenny needed me, and there was nothing I could do for her from where I was right now. I immediately began driving toward the hospital while simultaneously trying to contact Barb, my wife and Jenny's mother, at work. The nature of her job made it difficult to reach at times, and today was no exception. As I continued to drive toward the hospital, I decided not to call John, Jenny's boyfriend of 3 years. He had started a new job the week before, and I didn't want to contact him while he was at work. Instead, I called my business partner, Bonnie, to inform her of what was happening. I asked her to be prepared to go to the hospital in the event that Jenny's condition worsened before Barb or I could get there, since she was much closer to the hospital than we were. As I look back on this entire event, I think of all the times that my ignorance to the reality of the situation caused a naive belief that it's not so bad. This belief led to many bad decisions, or what now appears to have been irrational behavior, and 2 regrets that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. My decision to not ask Bonnie to go to the hospital immediately would prove to be the first. Once I had finally made contact with Barb, and after some discussion, I made the second of my bad decisions. We decided to meet at home and go to the hospital together. It made sense at the time. Had what I learned when I arrived at the hospital been clear to me then, I would have asked my business partner to drop everything and get to the hospital as fast as she could. I never would have taken the time to go home and wait for Barb to get there. I'm not sure when I will be able to forgive myself for making some of the decisions I made that day. But having received a phone call from a person I had never met telling me something so unusual had happened to my otherwise healthy daughter, while reality didn't sink in for quite a while. Barb and I arrived at the emergency room of Methodist Hospital somewhere around 5 p.m. I will never forget my first glimpse of Jenny through the narrow window in the door to her room. For reasons that still are unclear to me today, Jenny appeared to be much smaller than she actually was. Sitting in that bed, in that moment she became my little girl once again. I had let her down by taking so long to get anyone to her side. She had on a hospital gown and was under a blanket pulled up to her waist. The usual collection of monitors and equipment found in any emergency room were around her, yet she was not hooked up to any of them. She was conscious, and in fact had her phone in her hands and was tapping away, presumably sending a text. While the look on her face was intent, it had a bit of fear in it as well. Sitting there in that room alone must have been frightening for her, and I must have felt like an eternity for someone she knew to arrive. Why had I gone home to wait for Barb? Why had I not asked Bonnie to go to her right away? For as helpless as I felt being so far away when I received the call, I still have not forgiven myself for not realizing that Jenny was even more helpless waiting for anyone that loved her, to get there and comfort her. I followed Barb into the room, and as Jenny looked up and saw us, she began to cry very hard. What we did not know at the time was that for some reason, even though our phones would show that we had coverage, text messages were not being delivered while we were in the emergency room. The phones would show that the messages were sent, but not a single message Jenny sent while she was in the emergency room had gone through. 2 months later, I went through Jenny's phone to see who and what she had texted during that time. She had sent texts to Barb, John, and me. It was clear she had been expecting either Barb or I, because most of the texts were to us. Where are you guys? I'm so scared and confused. I can easily imagine the loneliness and helplessness she felt while sitting in the hospital room alone with no clear understanding of how she got there, along with the confusion and disappointment of sending out texts only to have no one respond for almost 2 hours. Once Jenny had settled down from her sobbing, the questions began about what had happened for all 3 of us. Jenny had no recollection of events from the time she parked her car in the parking lot of the small shopping mall called Bridgehaven in Minnetonka, Minnesota, on her way to her job at Barnes & Noble. We could not answer her questions, and she could not answer ours. Each question Barb and I had, searching for details of what happened leading up to Jenny getting to the hospital, were responded with, "I don't know, I'm confused," or just frustrated tears. Jenny was asking us what happened to her. In return, we had no response. Jenny seemed perfectly fine once she calmed down and began engaging in normal conversation with us. There was no sign at all of what we would ultimately learn was inside of her and what would take over her mind and body. Little did I know that the nightmare had already begun. What was simply mild concern over the details of what happened would transform into a series of events that would spiral so far out of control that, shocking as it may seem, at one point I would offer a prayer that doctors would find cancer within my daughter. What would turn into my own version of a parent's worst nightmare would become so haunting that I would be forced to stand by helplessly and watch my 25-year-old daughter's physical and mental stability deteriorate. Moreover, the changes that were relentless and unforgiving. Before we had the chance to adjust to what was happening, Jenny's condition would get worse. Not day by day, but hour by hour. This all happened while she was under the care of medical professionals who were unable to identify the cause, stop it from happening, provide her any relief, or save her from the demons that would haunt her as we all stood by and watched.